was good enough to be employed for the study of the village, for a simple reason that the village people were illiterate and you only can observe them, and if you don't speak their language, then the only way to do it is to see and get either interpreters or follow the technique. And therefore, 1955 was a major landmark in Indian history. There were three books that came out. One was India's Villages, edited by M. N. Srinivas, in which there were a number of articles written on different villages that were being studied in the country. A similar kind of a book came out, edited by Mackie Marriott, which was called Village India, where they tried to see the great tradition and little tradition, how they are meeting, and how a village in the Indian makeup has to be studied. There was also one book edited by D.N. Majumdar, which came at that time. But the only full-length monograph of any village in India that came out was by Dubey, Indian Village, and that also came in 1955. So 1955 marks a very major landmark in the history of growth of Indian sociology. And at that time, this question was raised. You see, at that time, let me say, India was conveniently classified into tribal India, rural India, and urban India. Today, my book is coming out from Routledge. I have contested this. I said, no longer this classification is available. A tribal India also has rural and urban. And therefore, we need to rethink the whole strategy of how do we structure the Indian society in the present context of change. 1955 also becomes important from the point of view of change that was initiated in 1952 through community development projects, which meant that we were not studying the villages as they were, but the villages that were in the throes of change. And therefore, those studies which came, they were studies of ethnographic nature, monographic in character, and were describing the villages. But people were raising questions. Shamirpet, does it represent India? And Dubey was bold enough to call it Indian village, as if there was only one model of India that existed, you see. So the questions about the representativeness of a village were raised. I recall Professor Chauhan doing an exercise by using secondary data and finding out all variables of villages, and then constructed a village which never existed called Hindupur, that it has to be this size, that size, away from the township so many kilometers. It was an average village kind of thing. But that average never existed. So the whole problem at that time was of finding out how do we study village and where do we study village. Shamirpet was called Indian village, but Shamirpet at that time, if I recall, was 25 miles away from Hyderabad. Last night when I came, I was told that 90 kilometers I have to travel from the airport to reach Shamirpet. And the Shamirpet where I reached, that village is not there. Even this is not Shamirpet. Shamirpet is a village which I visited about 5 years ago. And as director of the ICSSR, I insisted that all the villages that were studied in 1955 or that time should be restudied. But there were no takers. all got interested in the community development studies and the changes that were there. And so there were studies of leadership pattern, this pattern, Panchayati Raj. And so constantly we went on shifting our attention. For Shamirpet, I approached Lakshman Rao, and he studied, but nothing has been published. Now, unfortunately, Dubey, who was a good photographer, but there is not a single photograph of Shamirpet village in Indian village, if you have seen it. And I went to his house, and I did not find any collection or album about this. So about 5 or 6 years ago, my son was here, and I was traveling in a car, my son's car, and the driver somehow mentioned Shamirpet. I said, how do you know Shamirpet? I thought it's a small village, it must have disappeared. What it is? He said, Shamirpet, I want to go. So we drove to Shamirpet. And the Shamirpet that I saw there was not the Shamirpet which I read. And I can say that I read Shamirpet very closely because I translated it into Hindi. And from my Hindi book, it has been translated into several regional languages, the Indian village. It was a completely different village with saloons, which doctors' clinics, and the thing has disappeared. And I realized that why Shamirpet has not been restudied to record the changes that have taken place since 1952, if not before. So now it's a crisis again that villages are continuously changing. And right in the morning, Professor Amitabh Kundu warned us of the avalanche of urbanization. I was with UNESCO for a number of years. For 23 years I worked. And in 80s we were alerted that we should now start teaching, asking social scientists all over Asia to indulge into the work related to urbanization. And my worry was that urbanization, okay, but villages are still there. The number of villages in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh is still growing. And do we leave them or do we study them? And the avalanche that he is talking about, unfortunately, we have not developed the social geology to measure the epicenter where it is. Perhaps we will be able to find out. But then, these studies were studies of urbanization, which has several meanings. Whether the number of people living in urban areas is increasing, or whether the number of cities is increasing, or that the villages are converting themselves into urban centers, what is happening? So the modality for research cannot be single, where we just talk of this. There are a number of things. And I personally believe that there is, and now since I am in the company most of economists, let me as a sociologist say that one agenda that needs to be full and learning lesson from the past is that the villages are becoming towns. Can we study them? The city is reaching the village. Simultaneously, the village people are reaching the urban. And therefore, there is a complete disruption of population. You go to Gurgaon, all your maid servants, all your domestic servants, etc., are coming from Bihar. But their families live there. You go to the plumbers or electricians, they are all coming from Odisha, but their families belong to Odisha. So the interface between the village and place of living and the city is of a very different nature. It is not a whole hog transfer. And therefore a new kind of equation in family relationships is growing. The concepts of conurbation and suburbation, which were taught in sociology, are now visible. when you move from Delhi to Haryana, where his student is an IAS officer, you see the pattern of conurbation. The entire structure of economy of the village is now dependent on how the new colonies are growing up. And for this, I do not think that there is any model available. And my personal view is that there are some kinds of studies which are needed, which are not normally done. As a UNESCO executive, when we confronted migration to Middle East, and I was asked to carry out studies in a number of Asian countries from where the people were migrating to Middle East. The whole approach was to see what is happening to the Middle East. We changed that. We got the studies done on what is happening as a result of migration to Middle East to the villages of India, or to the towns of India, or the Philippines, or elsewhere. And in the process, the middle range stay of the people in the cosmopolitan centers, which became a connecting point, was a very important one. And the whole idea that if you become urban, your relationships are broken, primary relationship, you become secondary and all that, was falsified. Because in Philippines, in Korea, we found that it was during the time of festivals, traditional cultural activities, that people will take leave and come. And they revived. And the villages became places where older people were living. So I think apart from the analysis in terms of statistics and data that are generated, and you can do copious notes and prepare, perhaps the social dimension of urbanization and what is happening to the structures where people live, from tribal region to villages to the cities, ought to be investigated. And this is an agenda where I think sociologists must come back and see that it is not something that you leave one thing and you go to another and just talk of things, which are Foucault is talking about or something like that. The agenda is right here, it is important, and it is challenging the fact that the modernity is not killing the tradition but reviving the tradition. So a series of new hypotheses can come up. And this is an area which I found missing in most of the discussions that we are having, because we generally believe that going to secondary sources of data and writing will do, or simple questionnaire survey will bring out the results. So I think there is an invitation and a challenge for sociologists and anthropologists to go back to their roots and see how they can contribute to the understanding of the changing nature of our society, at least to preserve this for the future, that they would know what was the nature and structure and culture of our cities and our villages. And this is a challenge that I throw to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Atal. You have brought a very refreshing idea and position about the process of transformation, rural-urban transformation and interconnectedness. I hope not only sociologists, anthropologists, but also economists will get into studying this process. Now, may I request Professor Amitabh Kundu take the presentation and pass on.
Mr. Chairperson, fellow panelists, colleagues and friends. Please permit me to make a departure from what I had prepared and what I had mentioned, the organizers that I'll be talking. Let me respond to the provocations. Provocations this morning, particularly the provocation, the challenge that Professor Yogesh Atal has given us, and see whether we can talk about this generalizations that Professor Dubey and Professor Atal made on the basis of the great Indian village to a higher level, and whether we can, as Mr. Chairman, you mentioned, break the barriers of disciplines. You see, there's a study by Brookings Institute which shows that Indian share in the middle class consumption durables is currently 3%. And this is also confirmed by the study of Abhijit Banerjee or McKinsey Global Institute. But the prediction is that by 2050, the share of India in the global middle class manufacturing consumption would be something like 29%, which is higher than the share of China. Now we are talking about Make in India. A large part of this will be produced, hopefully, in India. What are the implications of this, and where will we produce them? We, in Paris, we may talk that our per capita emissions is very low, but the whole world is only talking about the total emissions. You know, it's third in the world. It's talking about the rate of growth in your emissions, which is 2.4%, whereas European emissions have gone down to 0 or sometimes negative, but on an average 0.2, 0.3%. Now the point is, what kind of production structure should we have? Now from the supply side, there is strong argument that our production base has to be somewhat decentralized. We should take that to small and medium towns, to the rural areas, from the concentration in a few metropolitan areas or around that. Because per capita energy consumption in large cities, metropolitan cities, is something like 4 to 5 times that of small towns, and certainly much higher than the rural areas. Supply side argument is there, but what is the demand side argument? Often you would say, okay, you take the industries, who is going to buy? There's no demand coming up. Now, what I did was to look at National Sample Survey consumption expenditure data 2011-12 to find out this consumer durables demand, where it is coming from. You find only 35% of this manufactured consumer demand is coming from metropolitan cities. 30% is coming from the small and medium towns. And another 35% is coming from the rural areas. So there is a demand for it, and if your production base can be decentralized, under Shama Prasad Mukherjee Urban scheme, you're talking about cluster kind of a development, I'm quite sure the people from the rural areas would not have to come to the nearby smaller towns and buy that. There is enough demand base. And I was myself surprised. I said, how come metropolitan cities are catering to only 35% of the car, air conditioner, refrigerator, motorbike, furniture? How come 35% only? Because our demand, who live in the metropolitan cities, have been satisfied or being satisfied before 10 years, 15 years, is only the replacement demand. Whereas in the rural areas, the new demand is coming up. I would just like to mention, last week, very interesting set of data has been released. That is rural-urban breakup of total GDP. Now, I had looked at the growth rate of rural per capita income and the urban per capita income up to 2004-05, and we saw that urban per capita income was 56% higher than the rural per capita income, somewhere in the 50s. It went up to 2.86, that means 286% high, 2.86% times the rural per capita income. But would you believe, Professor Atal, what is the figure that has been given by 2014-15 GDP figure? Rural income growth rate has been higher than the urban growth rate. But there are definitional issues. I'm struggling with that. Construction sector has grown 3 times faster in the rural areas compared to the urban areas. Manufacturing sector's growth rate, just the data is in the website, has grown faster. I'm still trying to understand whether the rural-urban classification, how the manufacturing value added is allotted between rural and urban areas. But I think the point that Professor Atal has made, that at the macroeconomic context, one should rethink the settlement pattern which has emerged and we are trying to defend. Your McKinsey Global Institute now says that there will be 65 million plus cities. HPEC says 87 million plus cities. Is that the only model that we have, or is it possible to have a much more balanced urbanization? Can I, if I have another 2-3 minutes, I just want to respond to 2 other issues. And since Professor Mohanty is here, I am encouraged to become somewhat anecdotal, and remembering a couple of my meetings in the ministry. I remember in this meeting, most probably Dr. Mohanty was present, Kumari Shailaja, Honorable Minister for Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation, had called a large number of bankers and asked them, Sharif, the point that you are raising in the morning, she said, suppose we give you 5% interest subsidy and we give land title to the slum dwellers. Are you prepared to fund their slum building activities? Oh, and you have to spread the loan period for 15 years. Believe me, accepting 1%, I think 25 people were, they said it's very difficult. Cost recovery is less. Even if you give 5% interest subsidy, it's very difficult to reach the slum dwelling population. That is the kind of perspective. Next week, we had Hernando de Soto, the Lehman economist or administrative, I don't know whether you were present there. He had this thesis that only you give land title, slum dwellers would be able to take care of everything. Everything will flow smoothly. We have seen that does not happen. No. We did a study for about 17 countries. In 14 countries, including India, I did the Indian chapter. This was from DFID project. We found the moment you give land title, loans do not automatically flow in, administrative support is not there, and slum dwellers often tend to lose their slum title which is given to them. So I have a feeling that let's not oversimplify things, that just give land title and things would be resolved. Final point I wanted to make, because in the morning there's a lot of discussion on smart cities, and I think all the participants were very enthusiastic